By the end of the year 2019, the world started hearing a distant chatter of a new form of flu virus in China. This was thought to take the same course as other such outbreaks in the Far East in the past, like the swine flu and SARS. A phenomenon due to which wearing a face mask almost became a cultural oddity of the East for the rest of the world. In the 3 months that followed, however, very few in the world today remain untouched by the havoc caused by one of the most widespread threats to the human way of life in living memory. When the world sees the collapse all around and attributes it to what we now call COVID-19, we miss out the bigger picture. What the COVID-19 virus did was merely the flicking of a card in a precarious pyramid that had been created in form of the systems and structures that operate our world today. If we, as the human race, have to emerge from this cataclysm, and instead of relating a legend of a scary dystopian past, need to have a story of triumph and of the goodness of humanity to tell to the generations to come, then we need to open our eyes and understand what really led to what we see around us today. The germs of the current meltdown lie in the direction which the world took post-World War II, where corporations grew with a ferocity such that, today, business corporations, conglomerates, and organizations representing them, are more powerful than nations. This eventually led to creation of a world order, where corporations dictated all global policies, and not just those on trade, commerce and economics. This was formalized with the formation of the World Trade Organization, where corporations and blocks of nations could force individual countries to go against the interest of their own people, and be coerced to implement laws which went against their own national and public interests. The cumulative result of this was concentration of a bulk of the planet's wealth in very few hands, while a huge portion of humanity was reduced to a day-to-day subsistence-level existence. Dismantling of the government's responsibility towards public welfare, and instead, turning what was supposed to be the duties of a welfare state into money-spinning operations for big business. Reversing of a century of global efforts on empowerment of the masses and workers' rights, and thus exposing a mass of humanity to exploitation by a handful of rich and powerful. Big businesses, with their control over governments of the Western world, used a cocktail of sanctions, war profiteering, and sheer financial muscle to make a chunk of global economy fall in line. This whole structure had matured and become operational in the first decade of this century. The most prominent symptom of this was the global financial crisis of 2008. When the first shock spawned by unsustainable economic principles came, in form of the bursting of the subprime bubble, exposing the multi-layered monetization of junk financial assets, and the large-scale global manipulation by financial and banking companies. In response to this, instead of resetting and fixing the flawed foundations of the prevailing economic order, reserve banks of the world, under the auspices of the United States, took measures that sanctified what were up to that point covert and illicit business practices, which came to be accepted as business as usual. Instead of bailing out homeowners from the effects of fraudulent loans given in bad faith, and saving millions from losing their homes and becoming destitutes, the government chose to not only not punish the people in the industry that caused the crash, but even rewarded them. Due to this, while on one side, it made a large number of people fall below subsistence level, living from paycheck to paycheck, it also led to a large flow of free money through banks and investment companies, into stocks and related products market, exponentially inflating the wealth of the very people, who were the architects of the misery caused to millions. If even a portion of the money given to the banks as bailouts had been given to the public, it would have reduced the income gap, boosted consumption, and set the economy back on the path of inclusive and broad-based recovery. Instead, the measures taken caused property and asset values to crash, and nations go insolvent. Later, even these nations were forced to choose austerity, instead of boosting income and consumption, and thus production and overall economic activity. As this model made a larger and larger number of people all over the world poorer and poorer, it was not a sustainable economic model. So increasingly, measures of quality of life were relegated to the background, as indicators of growth and development, and instead, the stock market was held up and sold to people as the primary indicator of progress and growth. This indicator was easy to manipulate, as all that was required was a periodic infusion of free money into a handful of shares that were part of the indices in the major stock exchanges of the world. With the Bank of Japan, ECB and the US Fed playing the forward, others were forced to follow, in a race to the bottom, of falling interest rates, and increasing money supply. The fatal flaw in this approach was, that the increasing money supply did not result in any real growth in the wealth of the masses. As a matter of fact, on account of oversupply, the value of money fell, and along with it, the wealth and income of a majority of people, except for the rich. As this did not promote business and growth, the stocks did not have a fundamental reason to grow. Instead, to keep the optics of growth, it became an imperative for central banks and governments to irrigate businesses and stocks with more and more cheap and free money. This Ponzi scheme could only last as long as the taxpayers' money kept coming with clockwork regularity. As a result of this, the corporations grew richer and richer, while nations grew weaker. This changing environment ushered in an era of pro-capital governments, with a single-track agenda, coming to power all over the world. Except for the color of their skin, these rulers were practically clones of each other, with each implementing policies to match and outdo the other, to the delight of global oligarchs, and for some time, even the public. The sheen of propriety in public conduct, which was an essential requisite in the leaders of the past, was no more a constraint for this new breed of leaders. Stripped of the pretense to work for electorate, and the larger public good, they went on a shopping spree, egged on by the cheer and applause, orchestrated by the media and propaganda outlets, beholden to big business, and went on to implement tax changes, legislations to weaken worker protection, and those enabling wealth retention and growth, largely without much opposition and with bipartisan consensus, and at a speed never seen in the past. The wealthy of the world have come to own the ruling establishment so completely, that the illusion of the ruling establishment and opposition in politics today are merely a stage-managed charade, like a race, where all the horses are owned by the same owner, and the outcome of the race fixed. The idea that a country and a state should be run like a business organization was sold to the public. Using all modes of manufacturing consent, pro-business leaders were propped up as head of state CEOs, over career politicians, who had risen from among the masses, and derived their sustenance from keeping their electorate's interests at the top. This resulted in a proliferation of heads of states, who identified more closely with their benefactors in the business, than the average person on the street, but also clearly demonstrated a ruthlessness and antipathy towards the masses, and an unabashed allegiance towards the elite. At other places, like in case of the European Union, the public representation was short-circuited altogether, and where the most powerful people in the administration and policy-making were bureaucrats, who had cushy jobs, who were easily accessible to interest and lobby groups, but had absolutely no accountability to the public. In such a structure, the people were merely to be informed of the changes, and expected to fall in line, and minority interest could be suppressed or ignored. As a part of establishing this structure, there was a sustained and concerted effort to demonize the social approach to running a society. All kind of subterfuge was used for this, the most commonly used of which was to confuse and equate the socialist state with the failed system of communism. However, this aversion to socialism among the oligarchy was selective. So, while on one side, there were constant sermons on the moral hazards of socialist state, and to demonize a social approach when it was applied to the general public, the wealthy and the powerful, consistently and shamelessly, continued to benefit from the same socialism, in form of financial support, bailouts and concessions, using taxpayers' money. Today we live in a dual-form economy, where the majority of workers slave under capitalism, while the super-rich enjoy the benefits of socialism. While the poorest amongst us pay indirect taxes, with the consumption of every item of food, and other products and service they consume, the benefit of bailouts funded from this tax goes almost exclusively to the banks and the rich. A big part of this concentration of wealth by West was done by cornering and hoarding of knowledge. While the scientists, doctors, and other experts, cultivated at huge costs by the poorer nations, were seduced to work for the richest of the corporations in the developed nations, the output of research and development, which was built on the foundation of collective human wisdom over the ages, was hoarded and sold back to underdeveloped nations, at huge profits, by implementing a regime of patents and copyrights, using the iron fist of WTO and other trade agreements, which were practically written by industry, and with enforcement mechanisms built in these agreements, to subvert the power of nations, and making them subservient to the greed of corporations. As a result, human knowledge was monetized, locked up, and thus, prevented from being worked upon by millions more, slowing down the development of science, and a waste of knowledge resources across the world, as the same problems were being solved across the world, but in isolation by different groups, instead of solving problems collaboratively. Also, on account of this monetization of knowledge, only those technologies which could be produced in economically viable quantities, and had a potential for a profitable market, were worked upon, instead of every single problem of humanity. As a result, financial viability and profitability, and not criticality and need, became the criteria for determining how much money and effort was to be allocated, and to what kind of research. Due to this paradigm, research into diseases like viruses, and other problems of the Third World, were ignored by Big Pharma, and instead, huge investments were made into pills and diseases, which had a big income potential among the affluent class, like in the development and promotion of opioids, and painkillers. After the economic opening up of China, a seemingly unlimited supply of labor, at unimaginably low wages, created a business model of global supply chains, which now is an indispensable driver of corporate imperialism. Global business czars went crazy, shopping for cheap labor in every conceivable area, from production of machinery and automobiles, to IT and back-office services, and to all those parts of the world, which were, up until now, exotic tourist places, or mere blotches on a map. This dealt a permanent blow to powers of collective bargaining of the workers in the developed countries, and drove down wages and thus widening the gap between the rich and the poor in the developed world, which had slowly been decreasing for decades. As a corollary to this, global production and consumption became highly susceptible, and a hostage to any event or factor which could disrupt this supply chain. Another outcome of a global marketplace was that overpopulation of humans on the planet, which was a clear concern in the past, for policymakers everywhere, was put on the back burner. More people populating the Earth meant more cheap labor, but more importantly, more consumers. This led to a clearing of great swathes of forests, from Amazon to Indonesia, for palm oil and beef production, to the destruction of forests and groundwater resources, in USA and Canada, on account of fracking, and tar sands oil production, to bottomless extraction of coal in Germany and Australia, and other minerals from Africa, to satisfy the demands of the swarms of humans, overcrowding our planet. Supplementing all the factors we have discussed, were strong attempts to scuttle all movement towards development of renewable, or decentralized models of production and consumption of energy. In line with this philosophy, all attempts to democratize and deindustrialize agriculture, and promoting sustainable methods of food and livestock production by small farmers, which threatened the corporate agriculture, genetics, and chemical industries, were tenaciously destroyed, using the power of money, courts, but most effectively, by using the arbitration mechanism built into the WTO, which is an agreement, written almost exclusively, by Western business interests. Any countries, or governments, attempting to disrupt the apple cart of reigning business interests, were effectively put in their places, by using all means possible, from relatively benign forms, like lobbying, propaganda, and courts and arbitrations, to more sinister forms of interventions, like military coups, regime change campaigns, economic sanctions, and wars. With the moving of goods and people, along the supply chain routes, to and fro, across the planet, and the heightened industrial activity, in tandem with the large-scale clearing of forests, led to an escalation in global warming and climate change. This resulted in impacts, some of which were obvious and predictable, but many others, which were less so. While the disruption of climate cycles, extreme and unpredictable weather, stronger cyclones, larger and more frequent forest fires, environmental pollution, and shortage of usable water, are affecting a majority in the world, and are therefore being talked about, the resurgence in insect infestations, and the increasing frequency of the breaking of the interspecies barrier, by parasites and diseases from other life forms, into humans, on account of the increased encroachment of humans, into the habitats of wild animals, are far less examined and researched. Changing lifestyles all over the world have resulted in food and consumption habits getting globalized and homogenized. This has resulted in large masses, especially among the poor, eating cheap, mass-produced, unhealthy food. Energy-intensive transportation and storage has led to people consuming the same kind of food all the year round, leading to an end in the habit of consuming local and seasonal food. This, combined with a widespread use of a cocktail of vaccines by humans, starting immediately after birth, has resulted in a marked decline in the natural immunity of the people, and consequently, a sharp increase in susceptibility to allergies, especially food allergies, and to germs and viruses. With the resources of governments shrinking, as the proportion of taxes paid by the rich, and the big business, in relation to their income, got smaller and smaller, and additionally, a part of this reducing pool also, getting sucked out by way of selective socialism in favor of the capitalists, on account of regular handouts, in form of bailouts and stimulus packages, the money available for spending on areas like public health, scientific research, and disaster response, became the first casualties of cost-cutting, by the governments. Due to this, while on one side, activities and infrastructure, in the areas of public health, and research, was handed over to the private sector, to profit from a necessity, which is a basic human right, on the other side, an impoverished disaster management system, was compelled to deprioritize, and keep, out of its scope, planning, and preparation, for contagion management, despite numerous scares, occurring with almost clockwork regularity, like the swine flu, SARS, Ebola, and Zika viruses, in the recent years. And instead, apply all of their limited resources, to take care of events like floods, forest fires, and hurricanes. After the dismantling of communism, and emergence of a unipolar world, there was an ideological vacuum created. This vacuum was filled by a powerful and unbridled global oligarchy, masquerading as capitalism. Through the agency of institutions like World Bank, and of IMF, this model of economic and commerce, the Davos Club, which zealously implemented its program of enriching a handful of global elite, at cost of billions worldwide. This juggernaut met its first major challenge, when some countries, in wake of the prosperity, which was actually a byproduct of this Davos Club mechanism, started to assert their sovereignty, and began to demand a bigger share of pie for themselves and their people. On account of a newfound confidence, economic muscle, and having tasted the fruits of a good quality of life, and equity of opportunity, and access to resources of this world, they were not willing to let go of it easily. The world was becoming bipolar again. Only this time, the divide was not on account of ideology, but driven by a war for the resources of this world. The oligarchy of the Western world was neither prepared, nor willing, to accept this new fork in their pie. Using the formidable influence they had procured by then, they launched a vicious retaliation. From opening of multiple fronts of war, both military and trade wars, to orchestrating of coups, and fabricating so-called people's movements, through proxies and stooges, there was launched an all-out war, with the governments representing the global oligarchy, coming together as a single front. However, as domestic self-interest, and those of local businesses, began to take precedence, cracks have started to appear in this united front. This was inevitable, because capitalism, like Erisaikthon, from Ovid's Greek legend, consumed by his greed, after it has devoured others, turns on to its own family, and ultimately, goes on to consume itself. Even as the Western capitalist imperialists escalated their efforts to maintain their grip on global resources, the countries that comprised this new second axis, instead of falling in line, began consolidating and resisting. China's demonstration of its ability to plan and execute, think on its feet, and use of cutting-edge artificial intelligence and big data to control, reverse, and reset its economy, has clearly showed to the world that cheap labor is not the only factor to be considered when deciding on the best place to locate business operations and factories. One cannot imagine any other country in the world where big businesses have begun to migrate their manufacturing bases, being able to handle and restore business as usual, like China has emphatically demonstrated in its handling of the COVID-19 outbreak. Another member of this new axis of influence, Russia, emerging from the ruins of the old Soviet Union, has in the last decade, become more and more potent and assertive, both as a player in international geopolitics, as well as economics. This newfound confidence was the reason that it could blatantly open a new front, in form of the oil price war. Its wide-ranging effects, starting with the shaking up of the petrodollar, wrecking of the shale oil economy, and as a consequence, American banking, which, irrigated by free money supply from the American, European, and Japanese governments, formed the bedrock and the lifeblood of the global oligarchy. On account of a fragmentation of historical alliances, and the weakening of global diplomatic platforms, most notably, the United Nations, when the first truly global threat, which was of the same scale and impact, as an alien invasion, or a global zombie apocalypse, the first reaction from the nations of the world, was finger-pointing, closing of the borders, hoarding of resources, and denying of cooperation. Every global player, and especially a bloc like the European Union, that in the past, had never tired of, superciliously putting on a display of its unity and solidarity, and superiority of its model as a prototype of the future, rubbing it in the face of the rest of the world, promptly cut off, like festering limbs, when the pandemic initially hit, its member countries, that were worst hit, instead of coalescing around them, sharing resources, and helping them out. With petty-minded men and women, in charge of nations, and people's destinies, in the times of a global and formidable calamity, humanity was left wanting, for towering leaders, who had led people and alliances, in times gone by, not so long ago. Each nation was left to fend for itself. The stories of world coming together, as one race, to fight a common enemy, and legends of heroes sacrificing themselves, to save a neighbor or a comrade, turned out to be just those stories, and wishful thinking, that belonged in children's comics and movies. As a matter of fact, some leaders went to extra lengths, in times of a grave crisis like this, and led the offensive of xenophobia and racism, instead of rising to the occasion, and leading the charge to quash all negativity, and foster unity and brotherhood, which is the bedrock of the kind of cooperation that is needed to fight a war of such monumental proportions. It is in this context and the background that we have to see the end game, which is now playing out, triggered by the COVID-19 epidemic. From its origin in China, to each of its subsequent epicenters, business considerations, and not abundant precaution for public good, were given primacy. This led to criminal delays on the part of those in power and responsible, both in the acknowledgement of the existence and the scale of the problem, and subsequently, their attitude and approach to containment and eradication actions. Only when it became clear that the virus was going to affect the rich, as much as the poor, physically and economically, that powers that be, were forced into action. Even then, the response was primarily in the nature of throwing money at the problem, with the focus not being health and people affected, but the businesses affected. The compromised and fragile position of the largest chunk of humanity was exposed, when seemingly normal and prosperous existence was reduced to abject destitution, by just weeks of disruption, with no systems and processes in place to deliver basic food and health security to a massive number of people, despite a monumental growth in the wealth of the world. The depth of fall in the stock markets indicated that it was ripe and waiting for an excuse to fall, because it was, in the past, driven up in most of the markets by oversupply of money, and going against the fundamentals, where even hollow and bankrupt companies commanded premium stock prices. The most grotesque aspect of this whole tragedy, however, was the behavior, and the response to this tragedy, by the richest, and their surrogates. Their acts ranged from silence and insensitivity, to pure evil. The truth behind the facade of progress, and financial power of the wealthiest of nations, was exposed, as the much-celebrated economic power turned out to be superficial, and merely a meaningless number, as the so-called developed nations, despite having had a heads-up, failed to prevent calamities of epic proportions, the peak, or the full scale of which, we are yet to experience. The for-profit, health services, and massive cuts in public expenditure on health and social security, quickly turned what could have been a much better managed health crisis, by a display of global cooperation, and cohesive leadership, instead of a farce of pettiness and insularity, that we see today. And this is the full picture that we really need to see, to truly and fully understand why the chaos caused by the novel coronavirus, now christened COVID-19, was not just on account of a pandemic outbreak. The virus was but a catalyst in a complex chain reaction, which had approached critical mass. The collapse was inevitable. Had it not been COVID-19, it would have been some other event, or other combination of conditions. The timing of it happening, the scale, the ferocity, and the duration it took to implode, may have varied, depending upon the nature of these alternative possibilities, but the collapse was destined to happen. In the next part, we will discuss how this catastrophe could have been just another day, though a slightly hard one, in the life of this planet, and explore two alternative scenarios, which the world can choose from, to move forward, which will ultimately decide how we, as the human race, and consequently, on account of us being its dominant species, the world as we know today, will turn out. Till later then, best of luck, and be safe, and also, keep everybody around you safe. Bye.